So, good morning, everyone. Let's start. We have a busy morning, very interesting topic. Welcome to everyone to this session that will be talking about the economic case for the new animal welfare legislation. At the end of the year, the European Commission will publish a package of 4 new legislative proposals related to the animal welfare of kept animals, animal transport slaughter, and animal welfare labeling. It is therefore a pivotal moment for animals and citizens' demands in the European Union. The revision of the animal welfare legislation, firstly announced in the EU's Farm to Fork strategy, is long needed as the current legislation requirements only cover a limited number of farmed animals. It is outdated and hardly enforceable. The upcoming new legislation, in addition to improving animal health and ensuring better animal welfare, will have positive implications also for human health and environment. The social and economic advantages of improving animal welfare are known through the concept of One Health, but often asked the questions are, what will it cost? Will the consumers be willing to pay? Very common questions. So today, 2 reports will be presented on the economic case for animal welfare. We will start with the true cost analysis of current animal production on environment and health. The report compares the market price of meat, eggs, and dairy products under current animal welfare rules with the hidden external costs on our health and environment. It also seeks to translate these costs into euros and project future costs under a scenario with improved animal welfare. I might say I'm very curious to see this presentation. Following this, we will look to another study on consumer behavior and willingness to pay in relation to the revision of animal welfare legislation. These researchers propose a new framework within which consumer behavior and motivation should be considered. This framework is then applied to understand how consumers can be motivated to purchase products with animal welfare labeling. We are joined by Andreas Husman, manager responsible value chains, here on my left, and Lee Hubiger. Did I do it?
That's good.
More or less, okay. Associates, both from the Impact Institute in the Netherlands, and by Dr. Marcel Cornelis, senior scientist, marketing scientist, and data scientist from Wageningen, okay, I made it, University and Research, so on my right. We will first listen to the presentations on the true costs of animal welfare sourced food production and consumption, and then open the floor for questions and answers. After that, we will listen to the presentation on consumers' behavior and willingness to pay, followed by a further discussion slot. So please don't be afraid of making questions and interact with the speakers. I'll make some brief announcements. First of all, the Commission statement in plenary on a long-term commitment to animal welfare. Last week, the Conference of Presidents agreed to a Commission statement in plenary on long-term commitment to animal welfare, which will take place this afternoon between 3 and 4. Regrettably, there will be a motion for resolution linked to this statement, but we tried. This debate is a follow-up to the oral question on EU Commissioner for Animal Welfare, which has actively been promoted by the Animal Welfare Intergroup, so very active on this front. Second topic, the publication of the oral question on prohibiting chick and duckling killings in the EU law. On behalf of Sirpa Pieter-Einken, I would like to thank all of those who gave their support to the oral question prohibiting chick and duckling killing in the EU law, which has been published early this week. Now comes the task to make sure that the oral question will get the chance to be debated in plenary and that it will be followed by a motion for resolution. I will regularly update you and the intergroup on the coming 3 months on the state of display in this process. The third point, it's the update on the work activities of the Intergroup's working group on animal welfare labeling. On behalf of Sarah Wiener, the chairwoman of the working group on animal welfare labeling, I would like to inform you that the working group has agreed its manifesto, which is available on the Intergroup website. Should you need any further information regarding animal welfare labeling, the coordinators of the working group, Alexandra Joss and Andrews Mans, for FOLPOS, will be more than happy to provide you with further details. And a last point, we would like also to reiterate the action that was taken by Sea Shepherd Global here in front of the European Parliament in Strasbourg, where they brought 7 dolphins dead that were picked up on the coasts of France due to some industrial fishing activities in the Gulf of Biscay. We have followed this issue. We already made some questions to the Commissioner. We see some reluctance of the member states, namely France, to do some actions to stop this unfortunate killing of dolphins, and we will continue to follow this issue. And we also thank you, Sea Shepherd Global, for the action that was very visible to an issue that is very dear to our hearts, the protection of these wonderful marine animals. Before we start with the presentations, I will briefly highlight some practical aspects for the running of this session. This meeting will be live streamed on Interratio. It will be recorded. The video recording and presentations will be uploaded to the Intergroup website afterwards. So we go to the first presentation. I will give the floor to Andreas Husmann and Lynn Uberger from the Impact Institute, who will present the report, External Costs of Animal-Sourced Food in the EU. Mrs. Husmann and Mrs. Uberger, the floor is yours. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. Yes, and thank you all for joining today. So we will be talking about the true cost of producing and consuming animal-sourced food in the EU. But before we start, we'd like to tell you a little bit about the background of our organization. So if you could go to the next slide. So the 19th and 20th centuries have greatly increased GDP. Tenfold since 1810, but this has come at a cost. Climate change is threatening livelihoods and it results in a 25% decline of global GDP, while 1 million species are threatened with extinction. More people than ever are in a form of forced labor, and 20% of the global working population is working poor. We would like to change that. So on the next slide. Currently, the current economy aims at maximizing financial value. This results in business models that are extractive, that are extracting natural capital and using unfair labor conditions to get to profits. We advocate to get to the impact economy, which has as a goal the true value and which has a generative business model. A generative business model that is based on respecting human and animal and environmental rights. So on the next slide, the Impact Institute envisions an impact economy, which is an economy in which work, entrepreneurship, technology, and innovation engender a better world. We want to realize this by providing organizations with the tools, the data, the training, and the advisory to measure, report, and manage their impact. We do this for a wide variety of clients, from the banking sector to the food sector to the energy sector. And we do this for clients which are big corporates, which are small or medium enterprises, which are NGOs and governments. Now to the method at hand. On the next slide. What is true cost accounting and the true price? So the true price of a product is the retail price plus all of the environmental and social costs, or the true costs. True pricing is being used in the field of true cost accounting, an accounting method in which organizations assess and report on their environmental, social, and human impact in a monetary value. By monetizing external costs, the effect of an organization's activities on society can become visible and comparable. This information can help to support the development and implementation of policy and economic interventions towards more sustainable business activities. How does that work? So if we go to the next slide, how do we actually calculate the true price? We do this by multiplying a footprint indicator with a valuation factor. So a footprint indicator can, for instance, be the amount of greenhouse gases emitted all through the production value chain of a product. And the monetization factor is a value that is the remediation costs. So those are the costs that have to be made to reverse and prevent the damage that is done to society. Each of these impacts is then added up to get to the true price. The next slide, please.
Does this work? Yes, thank you. So we've used this method to perform a true cost assessment, particularly on the production and consumption of animal-sourced food in the EU. If we can go to the next slide, please. So first, we'll briefly discuss what we've looked at. So in terms of types of animal-sourced food, we've looked at red meat, white meat, dairy, and eggs. And as I said, we've looked at both production and consumption. So if we've looked at the value chains of production, what we talk about is production within the EU, where consumption may take place either within or outside of the EU. And similarly, production of the input products required for this production of animal-sourced food may take place inside or outside the EU. Then in turn for consumption, consumption within the EU of animal-sourced food might mean that the production of these products might take place within or outside of the EU. So we look at both scenarios. And then just to clarify, when I talk about value chains, we look at the full value chain. So starting from the cultivation or growing of inputs up to the consumption by consumers. If we go to the next slide, thank you. So just to clarify on the true cost that we've looked at, firstly, there's animal welfare loss, defined as the animal life years suffered as a result of low life quality conditions in stock breeding. Underpayment represents the gap between workers' actual wage and the local living wage. Air pollution, which captures both the human health effect and effect of the environment, resulting from emissions to air. The water pollution captures both freshwater and marine water eutrophication. Then there's soil quality. So the decline in soil quality may result from soil erosion, from water and soil compaction, and the human health effect of pesticides being emitted to soil. Then the contribution to climate change is the effect suffered by both current and future generations from greenhouse gas emissions. Land use reflects the opportunity cost in terms of ecosystem services from decreased availability of land for purposes other than its original one, such as, for example, for tropical rainforests. Then we also have the indicator of biodiversity loss, which is not yet reflected in the initial findings that we'll present today, but it reflects both the direct impact on biodiversity from land use, as well as the indirect effects from air and water pollution and contribution to climate change. Then on the human health, we look at the diet-related disease. So here we'll actually quantify the incidence and human health effect of cardiovascular disease, kidney disease, and cancers, which are attributable to the consumption of animal-sourced food. Then zoonotic disease, which occurs when zoonotic diseases are transmitted from animals to humans, either through direct contact during working with infected animals or through contamination of food and consuming that. And then finally, antimicrobial resistance, or AMR. This occurs when pathogens change over time and no longer respond to medicines. For this study, we've currently not been able to quantify this due to lack of data. If we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So the final element of the scope of the true cost assessment, as I mentioned, we're assessing both the true cost of the current production and consumption system, but we also compare it to a so-called better and less scenario to see whether there's opportunity for true cost reduction. And so in this study, the transitioning to the so-called better and less scenario would entail better production, currently defined as an increase in organic production from current levels to 25%, and improved animal welfare measures. So for example, lower stocking density and lower transport times. Then this should be complemented with a dietary shift to facilitate for consumption of less animal-sourced food products.
If we can go to the next slide. Yeah, so what we see here are the results of the true cost of, on the left there's production, on the right there's consumption. And what we see is that the total true cost of production are 1,575 billion euros. That's 7.5 times as much as the economic costs of the ASF production. Similarly, for consumption, we see that it's 1,473 billion euros, which is 7.8 times larger than the economic costs of consumption. The figure also illustrates that we looked at 3 different parts. So there's the social impact, human impact, and environmental impact. And on the next slide, we will go into each of these. So if we go to the next slide. This graph shows the breakdown of the current production of animal-sourced food. So what we see is that animal welfare and diet-related diseases are the largest impacts. Combined, they make up 73% of the total true costs. What we also see is that in terms of environmental impact, air pollution, land use, and climate change are the largest impacts. Environmental costs like these can result from activities such as applying chemical fertilizer during feed production, nitrogen deposition from manure, or methane emissions during cattle breeding, to just name a few examples. In addition to the true costs presented here today, there are also true costs which are currently very difficult to quantify, such as antimicrobial resistance in both humans and in livestock. To reduce the true costs, we assessed some possible pathways for better production. And as introduced earlier, better production is defined as increased levels of organic production and improved animal welfare through, for example, lower stocking densities and lower transport times. So if we go to the next slide, this overview illustrates some various pathways of these improved animal welfare measures. These results are currently based on qualitative research, and what we see on the top is that obviously these increased animal welfare measures lead to decrease in stress levels for animals and improved animal health, which leads to improved animal welfare. But in terms of human health, there's also potential impact. So we see that lower stocking densities and lower transport times can reduce the risk of spread of zoonotic disease amongst livestock and also the transmission to the human population, which in turn can decrease zoonotic disease with livestock as a host and also decrease healthcare costs and economic losses through those diseases. We also see that those animal welfare measures can decrease stress levels in animals and the need for antibiotic use in livestock production, which can greatly decrease the prevalence of AMR in livestock and then also the risk of transmission of AMR to humans. Currently, it's estimated that healthcare and productivity costs in the EU resulting from antimicrobial resistance are already 1.5 billion per year. In terms of environmental impact, the overview illustrates several effects of the lower stocking density and increase in organic farming. One example is an increase in maintenance of permanent grasslands, which can then increase biodiversity levels. This overview shows the opportunity of using improved animal welfare measures as a building block to transition to a more sustainable EU food system. On the next slide, we will see the similar overview of the true cost of current consumption. Also here, what we consume leads to a large impact on both animal welfare as well as diet-related diseases. The publication of this study will discuss the results in more detail, including opportunities for reducing the true costs attributed to consumption of animal-sourced food in the EU. Now, if we go to the next slide. In conclusion, the initial findings of our true cost assessment show that there are very high true costs associated to the current EU production and consumption of animal-sourced food. Key causes of both of those results are animal welfare loss and diet-related diseases. We observe that causes of animal welfare loss are interconnected with other forms of impact. So to illustrate, high stocking densities can increase the risk of disease spread among livestock and humans. Finally, as discussed, we were not able to quantify all of the forms of the true cost due to insufficient data. In terms of recommendations, we see there's a lot of opportunity to reduce the true cost of the current animal-sourced food system. Better production has the potential to positively impact animal welfare as well as human health and farm-level biodiversity. To avoid potential increase in land use from organic production, we advise to combine better production with a dietary shift of animal-sourced food in the EU. Also, we advise to request research to increase the data availability in order to quantify impact on animal-sourced food system. For example, the impact of human health, of meat consumption and antimicrobial resistance, as well as the impact of organic farming. Thank you. Thank you for your attention, and we hope our work will support your discussions for revising the animal welfare legislation and its role in transitioning to a fair, healthy and sustainable EU food system.
Many thanks, Andrea and Lynn. I do think your work will be very helpful on the upcoming challenge that we have here in the European Parliament. I forgot to mention that we have our interpreters and we have the Polish, Italian, French, English and German interpreters in the room, so be free to speak your beautiful language if it's one of these. I'll now open the floor for questions and the debate for 25 minutes more or less. Feel free to make the questions, try to make them as brief as possible so more people can interact. And the floor is open, so I'm checking here. So one, it can start by our colleague. Yeah.
With the unpronounceable name, I know it, I mean, by heart. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and our speakers, distinguished speakers of the panel. Probably two aspects. This Impact Institute, I mean, you represent, to what extent your methodology, was available for analysis among well-established institutions like, for example, OECD or even UN? I mean, do you share your methodology in order, to promote kind of a bit more global and kind of thinking which might transfer this methodology to economic, environmental policies and concrete actions, not just on the national but on the global level again. My second point is, of course, I mean, true costs are always higher, and rightly so. They probably represent a quite different point of view of humankind relationship with the environment and our Earth, but it has a certain impact on food security, because we need, in spite of all, not just quality but quantity. And animals, people, they have to be fed with something, all right? So to what extent this methodology might impact food security issue, which is quite a major dimension, I have to admit, in our life. We see a lot of things going on now, even with the grain produced previously and in Ukraine. One country is taken out of the supply chain, and immediately we see an impact. Do you have any analysis of this kind, which might illustrate the possible impact on food security as well? Thank you.
I forgot to mention the name of our colleague, Petras Austrevicius, sorry for the mistake. So please feel free to answer.
Thank you. And thank you very much for your questions. So maybe firstly, on our methodology, so we use the True Price method, which is developed by True Price, and that stems from, or it's based on global institutions like the OECD Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights. We have also published all of those methods together with Wageningen University. So they're freely available to check how we do it online. Yeah. And then maybe on your second question on food security, it's a very good question, and of course a major problem globally. It can be part of the impact that we measure. In this case, we say that a dietary shift is also needed to maintain food security. So, for instance, I just read that 100 grams of chicken actually needs to 109 grams of soy feed. So you can imagine that if we shift part of that diet, then we can maintain food security.
I would assume to a more plant-based.
Yeah.
Exactly, okay.
Yes,
just,
exactly.
just to be clear. So I will pass the floor now to Mrs. Bruna. Please, you have the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Mesdames, merci.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for your presentation. And I'm sorry I came in a little late. I have a few comments to make because I was a member of the Committee for the Transport of Live Animals, the committee, and I started to have wanted to put in place mobile slaughterhouses because that would bring down the stress for animals and also for farmers. Do you have any data on that? And I also, speaking about France and possibly in other member states, costs are quite high for farmers, and many are concerned about animal welfare, but because of costs, they don't manage. That's why we have so many suicides amongst them. I saw something on TV recently, and it was very, very upsetting to see what the situation is. And this, of course, damages our agriculture and also animal welfare. Our imports of a very low-cost meat that comes in. So it's high time for us to impose more taxes or demand that importing countries, or rather countries from which we import, they should do something about their costs. So I'd like to have your views on that. Thank you very much indeed.
I missed the first part of the question, but I think what you're referring to is the stress. Does this work? Can I? Okay. Is the stress faced by farmers and basically the low prices that they're faced with, and therefore demanding an increase in animal welfare would be difficult currently? Is that being translated?
Pardonnez-moi, je vous posais deux...
I put two questions. I asked whether you had any data about mobile slaughterhouses, because that reduced the stress, because transport of animals really creates a lot of stress. In this inquiring committee, if we avoid transport of live animals, it's one way of bringing down the stress. And also I asked about meat imports from third countries, because their standards are not in conformity with ours. And of course, our farmers cannot produce meat at such costs, at such low costs. This is also very bad for animal welfare.
Okay. Thank you. I understand your question now. Okay, so the first one, if we talk about data on mobile slaughterhouses, what we're looking at in the assessment is reduced time between transportation and slaughter of animals. So that is, well, it may take form in many different ways. I think specifically the case of mobile slaughterhouses we didn't look at, but we do look at reducing the time and the effects of that on both animal welfare and other forms of impact. On your second question, and this for us also relates to the topic of food security, we see that it's very important that farmers also need to make a decent living for us to have a sustainable food system. So, for example, you could be thinking about redirecting subsidies to ensure that farming also within the EU becomes a viable way of living, and therefore also enables people to make investments required to, for example, facilitate more sustainable food systems or increased animal welfare.
Okay, thank you. I'll now give the floor to my colleague, Mr. Vizevzik. My God, sorry. Please.
All right. Thank you, Francesco, for the floor. I apologize. I didn't have the chance to really attend the whole presentation, so maybe I will repeat something that has already been stressed. But to me, animals and farming animals are not only really the source of negative aspects or costs, but in regard with, let's say, restoration ecology or biology, they are really like irreplaceable factors for grazing. And they cannot be really replaced in that regard. And I think that their role is very much positive in this context. So how deeply or how thoroughly this has been actually reflected in your accounting? And maybe a question, is there a form of herding an animal or keeping an farm animal where the positive aspects will actually prevail in the total accounting? And the next question, I'm currently working on IED, Industrial Emissions Directive, which seems really something far away from agriculture, but there is an intention of the Commission to include also intensive cattle farms under the scope of this legislation, which I welcome personally very much. But on the other hand, I see a huge resistance of our agri colleagues to actually even speak about this idea. it should be really based on thresholds of 150 cattle units that were proposed by the Commission. I think we will probably end up with higher number. But what is actually your idea about the inclusion of these intensive cattle farms into an industrial emissions directive? Maybe some of your remarks. I would very appreciate that to hear that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for those questions. Maybe on the first question, so we did look at that, but we did it more qualitatively due to lack of data. So we believe that obviously current farming is too intensive. So that will not improve biodiversity through grazing. So we need to move to a different system where animals can still potentially have a place, but yeah, it needs to become. They need to have more space, really, and yeah.
Because that's exactly one of the factors that I'm actually thinking about to include into the threshold of the animals. That goes with the second question. We are thinking about the animal density of 1.8 up to 2 cattle units per hectare. So would it be somewhere around the space that you were actually mentioning right now?
I think it's also animal specific, right? So I don't know exactly how you incorporate this, but we can look at exact figures maybe later. I think there's more detailed number. I don't know them off the top of my head. Yeah, okay.
I don't know if you want to. Sorry, you continue. Sure, go ahead.
No, you had a second question, honestly, I'm not sure, but it sounds like it could be very helpful to include it there as well, because it has large emissions. Yeah.
Just to recall that this is not only for members of the European Parliament, so if other guests would like to make some comments, please do. Since no one has raised the hand, I will just make one comment and 3 questions, really direct. The first comment is related to one of the first slides that you presented, that you were talking about the cost and then making a correlation to a new type of economy. That reminds me of a book that I read that is called The Donut Economy, that obviously internalizes all the costs, and so that shift, I think, is also very relevant when we are talking about the real economic costs. So this was my comment. And now the questions. We are talking about the food security, but we rarely talk about waste, and we already waste a lot of food. So is it true that we are truly internalizing the cost of wasted food? Because I always hear the problem of food security, that is real in this economic linear model, but if we internalize the costs, the economic cost, the environmental cost, the animal welfare correlated cost of food waste, that it's huge on the European Union, doesn't this also show us a possible reply of that we don't really have a food problem, that we just have a management system that is really not well orchestrated and defined? Second, the finance. You talked about shifting the finance also when we talk about production, but you are clearly talking about subsidized industries. So the subsidies that we delivered to this type of sectors, but only through the European level, or you are also talking about municipality, national, because there's so many levels of financing that it would increase the threshold probably more if we internalize those costs. And thirdly, regarding the question of my colleague that is very interesting regarding the emissions, my biggest problem, and also to try to understand, if we shift this economic model to a more extensive production system, but we don't stop the consumption of animals, we would just have more area. So we have to destroy more forests, we have to be more extensive areas, and it's a different way of looking things. We cannot just say that we want to be more extensive, have more extensive productions, but we really have to decrease the consumption of animal products. In my perspective, this analysis was also made in your report. And sorry for the extensive question.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for the extensive questions. They're very interesting. Maybe firstly on food waste. So in our analysis, food waste is included in the total true costs that you see. And that also means that it's a big lever for change, right? So if we reduce our food waste, we reduce the true cost. Currently, it's not internalized. It's very cheap to waste food, and the cost of food doesn't include the external cost when you buy it. So that's a good point. On financing, yeah, I think it should probably be combined measures, but I'm not too well into financing on all of these different levels, so I wouldn't be able to say where the biggest effort should be. But on your last question, indeed, so land use is a big factor in this, right? So you also saw that it was one of the biggest impacts in the total overview, and it will increase if animals have more space. But we do advise that this goes together with a dietary shift. So we really see that by reducing the amount of animal-sourced food that we consume, a huge amounts of land become available that are currently used for instance, feed production.
Thank you very much. I don't see any hands raised, so we'll go to the next presentation. Thank you very much, Andrea and Lynn. I'll now give the floor to our speaker from Wageningen. Exactly. I did it. University, to present the report, Consumer Behaving, Willingness to Pay, and the Revision of Animal Welfare Legislation. Dr. Cornelis, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Marcel Cornelis, and I'm indeed from Wageningen University. And I would like to take this opportunity to say that I studied in Groningen, and then I went for my job to Scheveningen. And now I'm working in Wageningen. So, yeah, if a city ends in Ingen, then it's probably a Dutch city. Well, let me further introduce myself a bit more. I'm a researcher in marketing science and data science, and I work for the Wageningen Economic Research Department, in which we perform studies and investigations for organizations and companies. In my job, I study more and foremost the demand side of markets, of business-to-business markets and business-to-consumer markets. And and one of my roles is to develop quantitative ways to model the demand side of markets, and using these models to determine the responses of consumers to actions, to interventions in markets. That brings me to the next slide, please. Our team was asked by the EFA to write a research note on the topic of consumer response to interventions which can be connected to this change in the EU law, in the EU legislation on animal welfare. And we are currently still writing on this research note. And this presentation is a summary of the things which are going on in this project. The topic of interest can be divided in three main components. One of them is a revision of the EU legislation, which we categorize in our project as a way of policy making. And that underpins all kinds of activities, new activities or modified activities that may affect the consumer choice behavior in the EU markets. And we can refer to those type of actions as interventions. Well, what's very interesting and important and crucial to know is how are consumers going to react to these interventions. And to understand that, we came up with a framework in this research note that can help to understand why some consumers are inclined to a behavioral change into the direction of buying products which benefit animal welfare, whereas other consumers are not so willing to do so. And this framework, which is on the next slide, represented by blocks, is the key part of the project, and it's based upon recent developed research, in which, based upon all kinds of empirical research on consumer behavior and behavioral change in individuals, among individuals, a framework of various types of frameworks have been proposed to link together policy categories, interventions, and behavior of individuals. We based our framework that we proposed on these recently published frameworks, and we came to a number of categorizations. So in the research note, we identify 6 aspects of consumer choice behavior, 9 intervention actions which can be used as instruments in the hands of policymakers to affect consumer behavior, and which have to be supported by policy making, and there we identify 7 policy categories. Well, for the ease of the presentation, I won't go into detail in an elaborative lecture on all these aspects, but I would like to focus on the aspects of consumer behavior, because they may help us to better understand the way in which we may think that consumers are going to respond to changes in the market. What I would like to stress is on the following slide that these categorizations do not. I would like to go to the following slide, please. That these categorizations don't have a one-to-one relationship with each other. So, for example, the same change in legislation may support various types of interventions, for example, front of packaging labeling. And different interventions may help to stimulate one aspect of consumer choice behavior, on which I will elaborate in the next slide. So, and then I again refer to this research note. You should see that all kinds of things which are available and usable for policymakers should be seen as being useful in combination with each other. There are many interrelationships between policies, interventions, and expected consumer responses to them. Now I would like to go a bit more into detail about these aspects of consumer behavior that we think are very important to keep in mind when you are developing new policies. The first one is the individual self. So many consumers are inclined to change their behavior if there is some kind of benefit to their personal self. And that can be, for example, be something that it's more healthy if we talk about food products, or that it gives a better, or that it is in accordance with their self-image. And that can be a very important driver for consumers to change their food choices in supermarkets and at retail stores. Another one is the social influence. So many consumers, when they make a choice, they somehow are influenced by the way they think that the people they deem to be important to them are looking upon them, or does my peer group approves if I choose for this specific product? And that can also be a very prominent driver for consumer choices. A third one is the tangibility of the food choice itself. For example, if we take a healthy product, that is for many consumers, healthfulness is very, personal health is very tangible for many consumers because it really affects your own person. Whereas the health issues of people living on the other side of the world, well, they are relevant, but not as much as relevant as your own personal health. So you can see already here that there is some difference in tangibility between different aspects which may help to stimulate consumers to change their choice, or if you can't get the message across about how tangible specific choices are, may help to explain why consumers are not willing to change their behavior. So these were the first three aspects. Now we'd like to go to the next three to make up our number of 6. And that's about the more dynamic aspects of behavior, I would say. A lot of consumers are stimulated by affection, about feelings about their choices. And we can see in markets that some interventions are also very well working with feelings. Think about very nasty pictures on cigarette packages, or commercials that give some kind of warm glow feeling if you buy products which are more pro-environment friendly, for example. Yet another group of consumers are more use more the a cognitive way of making their choices. And front of packaging labeling, for example, is a very good intervention which relates to cognition. By labeling products, you give consumers the knowledge to compare products and to inform products about the production process. And that may also be an aspect of changing consumer behavior. And the last one is habit formation. In many situations, especially when we are talking about food products, consumers automatically buy the food they are used to buy. So there is some kind of habit formation involved here. And if you want to change that behavior, well, actually you have to do two things. First, you have to interrupt the automatic behavior of buying the old products. And then you have to try to make the new choices more automatically. And that can be a challenging task, but it's an important aspect if you want to understand why consumers go back to their old behavior and why others stick to the new ones. Now I would like to give a more illustrative example of how you can work with these aspects in this framework. And doing so, I took a look at the Inception impact assessment related to the revision of the EU legislation. And I came up with a possible desired behavior, which we may want to understand whether or not we think that it's going to happen or not, and what aspects, well, how all these 6 aspects are involved, and how, oh, thank you very much. Yeah, this is the slide I'm talking about. How specific intervention actions can be used to address these 6 aspects. So, as an illustrative example, I chose for the following statement, or the following desired behavior, to be more precisely. Are the consumers willing to pay a higher price for products that agree with the upgraded EU animal welfare standard? And before I continue, I would like to stress that when we are talking about changing consumer behavior, we are also talking about individual choices, but we are also talking about individual choices which are more in line with some other consumers, whereas others are more differencing with these consumers. In other words, there are segments in the market. So if I now discuss in more detail the aspects and the possible associated interventions, you have to be aware that these interventions may work for some segments in the market, but may not work for all consumers. But that's the interesting part here, how you can combine all those interventions to get to the desired behavioral change. So I would like to go to the next slide. So if the possible desired behavior is the willingness to pay a higher price for products that are in line with the upgraded EU animal welfare standard, then the aspect of personal interest may for some consumers be already the motivation to change their behavior and to pay this higher price because they are, for example, very pro animal welfare, and I think, well, if I buy this product, that's really in line with the person who I am. But for some other segments, it may be there may be some threshold to change their behavior in that direction, and then you may try to use another personal benefit which supports this behavioral change. And one of them is, of two of them are measured in this Inception impact assessment already. One of them is that these new products, well, I saw some claim that they are better for your personal health. Well, that's a personal benefit. And the other one was that it also serves a better food quality. And that can be an incentive for consumers to buy these products that agree with the upgraded standard because they are also of a higher quality. Another thing you might want to consider if you want to stimulate consumers in changing their behavior is to increase their knowledge about this new standard. And a way to do that is by using the intervention action of labeling. Another one is to make it more tangible. For many consumers in the market, for many segments, the whole topic of animal welfare is a concern, but it's also something abstract, something on the other side of the supply chain. And if you can make it more tangible for these consumers, that may be another incentive for them to change their behavior. And again, you see here how an intervention action can be linked to a specific aspect of changing consumer behavior. I would like to go to the next slide, please. Yes. And, well, I already spoke to you about feelings. So there may be consumers in the market who are who can be stimulated by addressing their feelings. So if you can create along these new products some kind of warm glow effect that you are very doing the right thing if you buy these products, that may for some consumers be a very important aspect in their shopping behavior. The next one is about making these higher priced products more automatic to to buy. And that's a difficult one, I would say. Well, you can first think about disrupting the old behavior, for example, by using personal selling in a store. Another one is to make the new product also more convenient to buy, and a way in which food products can normally be stimulated. Well, are we already on this slide? Oh, I wasn't finished yet. Is to make the higher priced products also, for example, more convenient to use. If you can combine it with some recipe in which you can use these products. These are only possible interventions, right? And the final one is to use social influence. For many consumers, the idea that you can buy, that you can show that you buy food products which are pro-animal friendly, can be a way to signal to the peer groups that they are good, that they will doing well, and that can also be an aspect which motivates consumers in their choices. I would like to go to the next slide, please. So, now I would like to say some very a short thing about this food labels, which are now used across Europe. But following our framework, you can position them as an intervention action related to ways to inform consumers, addressing the cognitive aspect of consumer change. So only focusing on this specific instrument may be too restrictive. I would suggest to see this way of stimulating consumer behavior in relation to all the other 5 aspects which may also be very important. I would like to go to the next slide, please. Finally, I would like to stress the importance of measuring. So all these 6 aspects may play a role for specific segments in the market. So if you make use of them, you at least have a complete picture. However, the total effect, the eventual effect, depends on the size of these segments and on the way in which these segments respond to the interventions. And that makes it very important to exactly measure how specific actions, what the response of consumers to these specific actions is. And to do so, you need real-life behavioral data and quantitative analyses of these data. And that brings me to the last slide. Well, it was in 5 minutes, right?
Yes, it was. Thank you very much for being brief, and thank you for the introductional part where you stated all the places that you work and studied, and that way I did not misspell them. Thank you very much. So the floor is open. I will give the floor to Caroline Rose.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you. And thank you for that presentation. It's so much a question, it's more a comment. And I liked your last slide. It's better to have pigs flying around than pigs being intensively farmed. Now, looking at the question of consumer behaviour, we realise that's a vital issue. But nowadays, in order to change the way in which consumers behave, information is of the essence. Now, I think that consumers are not well enough informed about what's happening where livestock are kept, what's happening in terms of animal welfare. Now, there are various organic labels, but those labels, as things currently stand, don't refer to animal welfare on the labels. Now, think, for example, of fish, because fish, for me, tend to be forgotten about when we're talking about animal welfare. But think about fish, for example. Couldn't you imagine something like we have for nutrition levels with the red traffic lights and the scale down to green in terms of animal welfare. Think about fish, for example. I'm on the fish committee as well, so I'd like to make that link as well. So you could have a red label if you want to indicate that the fishing is problematic for fish stocks. And you could do the same thing as well for animal welfare, for livestock. It'd be helpful, I think, for consumers to be informed about the way in which animals have been raised and how they've been treated throughout their entire life. We need to be transparent for consumers. We are anyway in a society where we consume too high a level of animal products. That goes for meat and it goes for fish and it goes for all other animal products. I think we need consumers to be informed about intensive agriculture, about intensive livestock raising, about overfishing, and we absolutely need to tell consumers more about what's happening inside these farms. Consumers need to really know what they're doing. I mean, imagine they go along to the supermarket on the corner and want to buy meat. Imagine they're wondering about getting more animal-friendly meat, but they cannot do so at present. It's hard for the consumer. Consumers see images put about by NGOs who've been on the spot and seen the conditions in which animals are kept, but it's hard for consumers to find their way through the maze. Thank you.
Hello?
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for your comment. And what's your exact question to me?
J'ai fait plutôt.
Well, it wasn't really a question as such. It was an issue I wanted to raise on labelling and on information to consumers. It was more of a comment than anything else. As I said right at the very beginning, it's not so much a question, it's more of a commentary. After all, as I said, we want to change consumer behaviour, and perhaps my question could be put in these terms. If we want to change what consumers do and change consumer behaviour, but how then can consumers actually obtain the information they need? Unless, of course, we set up precise labelling systems as to how animals have lived. So that's my question, really. How can consumers obtain the information they need? But it was more a comment than anything else.
Thank you very much for your comment. I can re-comment on that. So what I would like to say here is that I would like to give to you the I think the important idea that if we are talking about consumers, we should always keep in mind that they are very heterogeneous, and we can't address or target every individual consumer in Europe. I mean, it's technically and financially impossible to do. So we have to work with some kind of compromise between treating every consumer as a homogeneous individual versus treating every consumer as a complete different individual. And that's why, yeah, in practical life you work with groups of consumers. And you are mentioning about informing, but actually that's only addressing one aspect, namely through cognition, trying to persuade consumers to make a change. And that works for many of them. But there are also groups in the markets which are really getting confused by all types of information targeting at them, not only from NGOs or public policymakers, but also from the food industry, for example. And if they start to get confused, what often happens is that they are going to use some kind of heuristic to make their choice, because in the end of the day, They still have to make a choice about what type of foods they are going to buy. And then you see that the other aspects come into play. For example, they start to look around them and see what other customers are choosing. And if that, if it is the case that the other consumers are more willing to buy animal-friendly foods, then that can be an incentive for them to do that as well. So what I would like to say here is that you should not try to understand the consumer responses by taking one aspect in isolation. But I would recommend to try to get into the whole picture to get some more complete idea about all kinds of influences which may affect their behavior, and position information targeting consumers by means of, for example, labeling, as only a part of the solution.
Thank you. Again, the floor is open to everyone who wants to make questions, if they have them. Yes, my colleague, Bruna.
Voilà, moi je voulais juste faire aussi une observation.
A comment from me on consumer choice has various different scenarios. First of all, you have consumers who are concerned about animal welfare and about their health, and then there are others who aren't. And there's the question of those who are cost-driven. Some are concerned about health, some are concerned about animal welfare, but they simply cannot afford to be pickier. And then there are those who need more information. So I'd entirely echo what we just heard on that comment about information. And then, of course, there are consumers who can afford good quality products which focus on animal welfare, and they need to have clear labeling available, something that really is eye-catching. It's always very difficult to have to read the small print. For example, I do that when I'm looking at eggs. It's not always easy to find the information you're looking for, so it should really be labelled automatically and clearly on all the products that we might purchase. And that would mean that people could take a decision based on their own conscience to see whether there's been good compliance with animal welfare standards. We really need to ensure that we have this precise but also crystal clear labelling as to how the animal has been raised and indeed subsequently slaughtered.
So, if I understand you well, you commented on the existing differences between consumers in the market, and then you came to the conclusion that we need a crystal clear labeling on food products. Is that your main comment here? Yes. Well, I would like to respond to that in in two things that strike my mind at the moment. First is that all these different types of labels can have a confusing impact on consumer choices. On the other hand, suppose that all products have the same label, then the effect of labeling as being something which makes a specific product more salient in the eyes of the consumers will lose this aspect, because every product has the same label. And then you can ask the question, well, is is a specific label for all products then necessary, because all products are already following the claims of this specific label. So it's always, in my perspective, labeling is always some kind of relative thing in the market, because as soon as you put a label on a product, you make some kind of dichotomous distinction in the assortment, because you have the product with the label and the product without the label, and that will always have an impact on consumer choice. On the second thing I would like to comment is that, and I think more research is needed on that topic, is the following question I sometimes ask myself. Do many consumers need all necessary information when they buy the product, or do they need the possibility to get all the information if they want to absorb it? For example, you may think about a QR code on a package which leads you to a specific website where all the information is stored, so that you don't have all the information in very tiny letters on a package. That may make a difference in consumer choice, because I have the feeling that if you put so many information on one single package, it will lead to this confusion, possible confusion among consumers, and to a less crystal clear identification system. So there are more avenues to study, I would say, to tackle this topic.
Thank you. I would say that nowadays it's also not very clear when we look at the labeling. So, and I would assess that obviously if we are looking at labeling, we should try to make it in all products so it's crystal clear that we don't have this disparity.
Yeah.
And also when we are talking about QR codes, we also should understand the social impact of that, because there's a huge chunk of society that doesn't have access to smartphones, and on that level we also should assess that impact. I would just make also a comment that, for example, the EU spends more or less in agriculture marketing products 200 million a year, so that also influences the consumer perception of goods. We have an action regarding one specific marketing campaign that was made by the Commission that was called Beefitarians, Become a Beefitarian. That's implied, and here it was also correlated with our speaker's topic, that was not internalizing the true costs of that campaign, and so it almost sounds like, as you said, emotional and sexier to become a beefitarian, and that also correlates with external costs that are not internalized, and the perception and the behavior of consumers on some products. So I don't think it was clear in the beginning with the numbers, the correlation, but we would probably be very welcome of more studies with more clear data on how can we also as politicians be more productive in trying to have better and more information to help consumers in the end make better choices. If no one has any answers or questions, I would, yep, please.
Like to ask, do you think that a good label should take as much into account the 6 aspects you mentioned in your presentation, so that you take into account also more the feeling aspect of a consumer when looking at the product, so that a choice for a more animal welfare friendly product is taken?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and Well, I have the idea that the labeling is, for many consumers is some kind of summary thing about so much more which can be said about the food product, and that it's really related to other interventions which can be used to get a more extended perception of this label. So I can imagine that if you have a very clear label which is connected to a communication campaign which made this specific food choice more tangible, more effective and more cognitive, that it would really be helpful for the success of the label in the store. So that you combine different intervention actions to get to reach your goal, actually.
Thank you, Andres.
Yeah.
Just Caroline Rose, a brief comment, and then you can wrap up.
Juste, aujourd'hui, on a une...
Today we have a label called Nutri-Score. We could have another label on the same product on animal welfare and indicating how it has been raised and how it was slaughtered. So we would have two labels, one which is the Nutri-Score and the other one that would also be red and green. So two indications, two labels on the product, and then if the consumer wants to see what there is in the product, he has that label at the back. But the main labels is the Nutri-Score one, and then another one that would indicate animal welfare.
From Harriet, and probably you will reply the two in a row. Can be?
Okay.
Okay, so Harriet, please.
Great, thank you. Hi, I'm Harriet. I'm with Greens Agri Advisor. Thanks very much for all the presentations today. So for Marcel, I have a question actually maybe which is going a little bit beyond what you studied here, which is on labeling and consumers specifically. But I just wondered, I mean, here we talk about a multiplication of information that might be difficult, at least at first, hopefully not in the long run, for the consumer to navigate. But I wonder, is there anything more at the macro level about the food environment that you looked into in terms of policies or interventions that are maybe not only about the consumer, but the environment in which they find themselves and how that could help make their choice? I mean, it's a slightly different example, but I find that anecdotally, for me, where I am influences what I'm buying in a way. If I'm buying bio in a market, totally happy. If I'm buying bio in a supermarket and I see that it's got plastic on and it's just a different environment, maybe it's a different supply chain that has caused that to come about, that the final result for me is a different choice when I'm in the different retail environments, let's say. So I just wondered if you had anything in terms of policy that would go around the labeling in a way to to surround the labeling for the consumer so that the end choice is simplified for them by nature of the environment that they find themselves in. Thanks.
Just to make a remark that we only have translation until 11:30, so we have 5 minutes. So if you could be brief, so we then can make the final comments. Not rushing you, but rushing you. Sorry.
I'm trying to answer both questions with the same answer. Is that a way to keep it on the time schedule? So, well, both questions are very interesting because they say something about the context of the choice architecture in which the consumer makes the choice. And so I would like to say something about the context of choice, which is obviously very important. Adding an additional label on a package changes this context in such a way that there is now another prompt which may have some kind of nudging effect on the consumer. And also, what you refer to, like, for example, biological, I guess, the fruit in plastic packages, also has an influence on the perception of consumers. And in fact, there is a lot of research going on which tries to identify how why specific nudges, I call them nudges because the availability of the products does not change, only the way in which they are presented change, in which they, to what extent they have an impact, but then you have to bear in mind that these research and contexts are very complicated because everything can have an influence. And it also may depend on the timing during the daytime when a consumer enters a store. So you can imagine that real-life field research on this topic is very complicated, but it's certainly a part of the studies upon which these frameworks are built.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cornelis. I think we were all very enlightened by these replies. So to end, I would like to thank all the speakers for their presentations and for showing the economic and social benefits of revising the animal welfare legislation. It is important that the Commission recognizes this larger picture of the societal hidden costs of the current animal welfare legislation on health and the environment. It is also necessary to recognize the complexities driving consumers' adoption of higher animal welfare products. As we can see from the conclusions of the presentations, we need to support an ambitious revision of the animal welfare legislation. Citizens expect it of their representatives and brings benefits for the society at large. Following up on the affirmative presentations and today's debate, I would like to suggest that the Intergroup prepares a letter to the Commission in support of an ambitious revision of the animal welfare legislation and showcasing the wider benefits it will have, as it was also introduced here by both presentations. The final information, next sessions, well, they be next Thursday on the 23rd of March. My colleagues and Manuela Ripa and Pascal Durin from the Eurogroup for Animals and AAP will hold an event on EU positive list for pets, happening in Brussels. Invitations to register for the event have been sent. Next monthly, the Eurogroup, Intergroup, session will be taking place on the 20th of April and is likely to be dedicated to the successful ECI, safe, cruelty-free cosmetics. We look forward to see you then. Thank you very much and bye-bye. And thanks for the interpreters.